all for doing this.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. We are so excited to have you all join us for this Ensuring Housing Opportunity for All conversation. We'll get started shortly as people are joining the webinar. And just so you all know, you can see us, but we can't see you. So go ahead and feel free to continue to hang out in your sweatpants if you're working from home. No one will be the wiser. We'll get started in just a couple more moments. I'm excited to see such a great turnout to have this conversation around housing opportunity, especially during April, which is Fair Housing Month. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get things started. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us for this online panel discussion about ensuring housing opportunity for all. My name is Serena Unrein, and I'm with the Arizona Partnership for Healthy Communities, which is now managed by LISC Phoenix. We are co-hosting today's online forum with the Southwest Fair Housing Council, and you'll be hearing from 3 expert panelists as they discuss the current barriers to housing opportunity and the policy opportunities to transform patterns of poverty and ensure housing opportunity for all. A few things to note before we get into the conversation today. Like I said before, you can see us, we cannot see you. We're in the Zoom webinar format, but even though we can't see you, you're a key part of the conversation. I hope that you will ask questions in the chat, contribute resources and links, share your thoughts. We want this to be a robust conversation, so please don't hesitate to drop your name in the chat, tell us where you're from in Arizona, tell us what's on your mind, and ask questions throughout the conversation this morning. I'll try to get to as many audience questions as possible. So please make sure that you are part of the chat. We'll be recording this forum and sending out a link to everyone who registered for this event. So please feel free to share this conversation with your friends and colleagues. I'd now like to introduce our 3 panelists and thank them sincerely for generously sharing their time and wisdom this morning. We have Maya Abela, who is the Deputy Legal Director at the Arizona Center for Disability Law. We have Keith Bentele, who's an Associate Research Professor at the Southwest Institute for Research on Women at the University of Arizona. And we have Jay Young, who's the Executive Director at the Southwest Fair Housing Council. Thank you all for joining us today. And I'll go ahead and get started with our first question. April is Fair Housing Month. Can you share some background about what the Fair Housing Act of 1968 envisioned and how close we currently are to that Act's goal of outlawing discrimination in housing? Jay, if it's okay, I'll get started with you.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and an honor to talk to you guys about fair housing and all that entails. April is Fair Housing Month, so happy Fair Housing Month. You know, the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, and at the Southwest Fair Housing Council, we still deal with lots of discrimination. We get over 800 calls a year, people contacting us with housing issues, and we sort through those calls and determine, you know, where the actual fair housing issues lie. So, you know, throughout the year, we're filing complaints with HUD, with filing lawsuits in court. So, you know, housing discrimination is still a major issue in Arizona and throughout the country. But what I really want to talk about today is really focusing on what I think is the second part, or you know, the kind of other part of the Fair Housing Act that most folks don't know about, and that's affirmatively furthering fair housing. And the Fair Housing Act basically says that we're supposed to undo segregated housing patterns that were created by all levels of government, from the federal government on down, real estate agents, the private market, lenders, really a concerted effort in the 20th century to segregate us, particularly by race and ethnicity, and today by disability as well, for the most part. And we have not come a very long way, honestly, in addressing housing segregation. There were many different, very strong elements running throughout society, particularly in the 20th century. You had the New Deal where the modern mortgage market was created, and folks ended up being segregated because people of color were not allowed to access the mortgage market. You had highway construction, interstates in particular, that destroyed many communities of color and integrated communities and separated them physically. You had urban renewal a little bit later in the 20th century. And these really created the segregated housing patterns that we still see today in pretty much every major city throughout this country. And though it is now illegal to discriminate, based on the 7 protected classes, we've done very little to realize the mandate to affirmatively further fair housing in this country. And basically, we still are living with the legacy and the segregated housing patterns that we created in the 20th century. So, I would really encourage everyone for Fair Housing Month this year to think about housing segregation and how it still affects, most of the communities we live in, and how that affects people's ability to have equitable access to housing. So, we have made progress, certainly, but I think there's a lot still to be done 55 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act.
Which is why we're having this conversation this morning. Thanks, Jay. Keith or Maya, do you want to hop in here and talk about how close we are to outlawing discrimination in housing?
Yeah, I'll hop in. I will echo everything that Jay said, and also share, the issue with regard to what the law says and sort of where reality is still a divide. We have a long way to go. There has been progress made for sure. I wouldn't ever say that there hasn't been, but there is still quite a gap between where I think the law envisioned us being and where we are today. And I wanted to share sort of from the perspective that I have. We work exclusively on, disability related issues and working with people with disabilities. And, we certainly see still, I would say, broader scale sort of systemic issues related to, for example, local ordinance exclusionary zoning practices that, add extra burdens to locating group homes or, congregate living settings for people with disabilities. But I think by far the most frequent issue that we see come across our desks, and what I think gives rise to the many of the HUD complaints that get filed, relate to just a lack of understanding about what the reasonable accommodation and modification requirements are for people with disabilities under the Fair Housing Act, and specifically that those are individualized assessments. Whenever you have a situation where sort of brought bureaucracy and process come against the individual, I think there's always a little bit of a tension there, but the act actually requires some individualized evaluation. And going back a little bit to what Jay had mentioned in terms of fair housing complaints that get filed with HUD, I wanted to share a statistic that I think is a bit surprising, and that is that the largest percentage of Fair Housing Act complaints that get filed with HUD every year relate to discrimination based on disability. In 2022, it was over 50% of the complaints. And as Jay mentioned, we've got 7 protected classes under the Fair Housing Act. So it's sort of a pretty large disproportionate number of situations that are yielding these complaints arising out of the disability sphere. And this has been the case for, several years running already. And I think part of that, what goes into that high statistic is the fact that folks with disabilities are actually a surprisingly large proportion of our community. About 1 in 4 Arizonans has a disability, because the definition of disability is very broad. It's just a physical or a mental condition that substantially limits a major life activity. And I think part of that large class and that broad definition also relate to the fact that people with disabilities, I have a colleague that calls it the equal opportunity protected class because you weren't born with a disability or you didn't acquire one due to illness or an injury, odds are fairly high you might age into one. So it's a large group of people that we're talking about here. And then I think the other major component that goes into that large statistic for generating housing, fair housing violations and fair housing complaints is that what I mentioned earlier about the reasonable accommodation and modification issue. Those, just to kind of provide a little background, the Fair Housing Act requires what are called reasonable accommodations, which is a form or a change in a policy or a practice that might be needed in order to provide a person with a disability access to housing. And those are very common. They really can range hugely in terms of what is an accommodation that might be needed, but some really common examples are things like an exception to a no pets policy in a building so somebody can live there with their service animal, or waiver of a late fee for an individual who receives Social Security benefits and they aren't able to make their rent payment until the 5th day of the month when their check comes in, for example. And those are things that require a change in the way things are typically done to give that person with a disability, access to their housing on an equitable basis. And reasonable modifications are those kind of physical changes to a unit. So if somebody needed to lower countertops in order to be able to cook in their kitchen or install a grab bar so they're safe in their shower, those are things that, again, would require some change to how things are typically done or how the unit, typically appears. And I think the major kind of point I wanted to make is that, housing providers can be resistant to providing those accommodations if they're not educated in compliance about Fair Housing Act and sort of what it contemplates and what it requires for providing housing for people with disabilities. And I think there's this perception that providing an accommodation is providing some sort of an exception to a rule that applies to everyone, and therefore it's creating some sort of unfairness. And for the folks that are familiar with this area, I think it's really clear that's not the case. But that accommodations are really about creating equity in housing. And Serena, if we could put up the image, I just wanted to kind of share this image that I think is probably pretty familiar for folks in this sphere. We've seen it in different contexts, I think, over the last several years, but essentially it's meant to depict the critical difference between equality and equity. In this, depiction, the drawing on the left, gentleman who's already tall, doesn't actually need a box to be able to see over the fence and enjoy the game. And the girl that's in the middle is, one box is not quite good enough for her. She can barely see over the fence. And then the person that's in the wheelchair can't even use the box and is unable to enjoy the game. And so this is equality, everybody's getting one box. But it's producing, as we can see here, very unjust results. These people are not having equal access to this enjoyment of the game. And the same is true in housing. If everybody gets just the same thing, you're not necessarily creating housing that is what is contemplated under the Fair Housing Act. And then if you see on the right-hand side of the image here, we have what would be an equitable scenario where the gentleman on the left doesn't need anything additional. So he's able to see without anything. Then the extra box goes to the girl in the middle, and a ramp is provided for the person in the wheelchair. So they're able to actually achieve what is the goal here, which is to be able to see and enjoy the game. And the same applies for reasonable accommodations and housing. A typical unit, a person might be able to cook in their kitchen, get out of the shower easily, but a person with a disability might require some modifications in order to achieve that same enjoyment.
Thanks, Maya. I think it's really helpful to, even though I'm guessing a lot of folks on the webinar today have seen that before, I think it's really helpful to see it and think about it from a housing accommodation and housing opportunity perspective, since sometimes we'll talk about that in public health or with social determinants of health, but really thinking about making sure that housing is equitable. It's just a good reminder that sometimes different people have different needs. So thanks for sharing that. And Keith, I'll turn it over to you to talk about how close we are to that vision of the Fair Housing Act of making sure that we're outlawing discrimination, and just hear from you about what you're seeing in your work.
Thank you so much. Good morning, all. Privileged to be here. Following off of Maya's last comment, I just wanted to add in that, beyond the scope of the law and the discrimination policy, if there aren't available, affordable, accessible units for people, then this is a kind of a market constraint that really undermines the capacity of anti-discrimination legislation to really help people in that situation. And I bring that up partially because the recent census household pulse surveys we're seeing that are coming out on a monthly basis from the census are showing us increasing housing insecurity amongst people with disabilities, especially folks with very severe disabilities. And these are very high levels of housing insecurity. And so I feel like this, for me, is an example of a place where legislation like this doesn't get us to a point where we're addressing kind of a critical current issue in the market. And especially, these are folks who are often living on fixed incomes. We have this inflation that's gone up both and broadly across many housing costs, but also, food and et cetera. Right. So this is really pinching households in a way that is quite intense, and again, not something that is addressable through this law. The other thing I just wanted to mention, building off of Jay's comment earlier, so I'm a sociologist by training, that's my background. And so when I'm speaking in this area, what I usually point to is the remarkable stability. So Jay just said 55 years, 50 since this was passed. And if you look at trends over time, it could be segregation. We could be talking about home ownership levels. We've seen very, very little change in the market. In sort of very little progress along racial lines. And the question is, lots of other things have changed, right? I think particularly of educational attainment, right? If you look at educational attainment over time by race, we've had dramatic strides, real progress. This is supposed to be the avenue for improvement and improving your economic self-sufficiency. But if you compare that to a graph of home ownership by race over time, I encourage you to Google that. You'll see basically straight lines with some increasing disparities over time. Black home ownership fell between 2005 and 2015, right? So if anything, we've seen a widening of the gap in terms of home ownership. And I think, legislation like this, it does focus on the individual level, and it does prevent some discrimination, of course. I think it's a very important piece of legislation, but it doesn't move beyond that to the real structural inequities, especially racial wealth inequality, which is widely regarded as one of the major drivers of these patterns. Also, just add to that those structural inequities that have not been addressed, or in the case of racial wealth inequality, has gotten worse in recent decades. This is also what undergirds these very stubborn patterns of segregation that Jay was referring to. So segregation is complicated. It depends on the scale that you're looking at, but geographers and sociologists have done tons of work. And while we have had some increasing diversification along racial lines of our cities, that has come at the cost of increasing spatial segregation, as predominantly white folks have relocated to the suburbs, which some people have called sort of if you think about the massive federal investment into homeownership in the suburbs, this is sort of a massive transfer of wealth and a benefit that was very, very disproportionately available and accessible to white homeowners. And so economic segregation has actually gotten substantially worse, right? As there's been this increasing spatial segregation between the cities and the suburbs. And so if you look at schools, segregation has gotten worse along racial lines, especially if you're focusing on public schools. Again, if you compare the cities and suburbs, we have had increased racial segregation over this time. And again, economic segregation has gotten dramatically more intense, which means, and the statistics here are quite stark, your average African-American, Hispanic person, or someone from, sorry, I'm losing my notes here. I want to make sure I say the right thing here. Oh, from indigenous backgrounds, 80% of people who have African-American descent are likely to live in a low-income community. 75% of Native American folks, roughly 75% of Hispanic and Latinx folks live in a low-income community, as compared to 50% for white folks. So when you layer over the racial segregation plus economic segregation, you see real increased concentration of disadvantage, particularly in minority communities. So when I look at that and I compare that to the idealistic vision of what the Fair Housing Act was hoping for, I see an enormous disconnect and a real lack of progress. So again, I hate to be so negative, and it's like a professional obligation as a sociologist to be a downer or something, but that's where my mind goes. So.
Thanks for sharing that. And one of the things that I'm glad that you brought up is talking about some of the structural inequities and some of the underlying factors that really contribute to segregation and inequity. And I'll take it back over to Jay, because I know that the Southwest Fair Housing Council was active with the successful effort to increase the Tucson minimum wage last year. I think it was last year anyway. Time is strange these days. Can you talk a little bit more, Jay, about why Southwest Fair Housing Council thought it was important for a fair housing agency to be involved with that effort?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And again, I just tie it back to the idea of the need to affirmatively further fair housing. And, diving a little bit deeper into that, kind of as Keith was illustrating, when we're talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing, we're talking about access to opportunity. So where you live shouldn't have an impact on your access to education, your access to jobs, your access to healthcare, but fundamentally it does. And, I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar will understand that. But, if you look at a city like Phoenix, depending on where you live, your life expectancy can be different by 20 years. So, if you're living in a whiter, more wealthy suburb, your life expectancy is in the mid 80s. And if you live in a lower income minority area in Phoenix, it's about 20 years less. So, we're really talking about access to opportunity here. And, along with housing discrimination, one of the features of American society, still today, but particularly in the 20th century and before, was discrimination, employment discrimination. So, and I think you can look back at like the Great Recession, the foreclosure crisis. Communities of color were far more impacted by the foreclosure crisis. Jobs were lost because communities of color are still much more involved in manufacturing, service sectors, sectors that are impacted or were impacted in particular by the Great Recession. So, there's this kind of milieu of employment discrimination as well. And, working to raise the wages of all workers really does help to bolster the ability of folks to pay the rent and pay their bills and other things of that nature. So it provides potentially an opportunity for people to have more choice about where they live. And I think that there are a number of things that Keith brought up that I think are really important to keep in mind as well, that I think is really tied to access to opportunity. On the one hand, we want to have not on one hand, what we're really trying to achieve is an open and fair housing market. And, it's still really not an open housing market. So, we're really wanting to live in communities where folks can really choose to live where they want, higher opportunity areas. But I think on the flip side, we need to look at how we have invested in communities over time. And it is really clear, again, whether you're going back and looking at the baby boom and the suburbanization of America in the 20th century, the lending patterns, and that really benefiting white folks. We need to look at communities that have been marginalized over time and make sure that those communities are also being built up to provide the opportunities that folks in those communities need. So, folks really do have the option to live where they want to live and have access to the opportunities that they need. And the last point I'll kind of make, and I'm straying a little bit from your question, Serena, but I think it's important to note, and Keith brought this up as well, is that housing segregation in a lot of ways has gotten worse over the past 20 years, particularly since the Great Recession. So on the one hand, we're dealing with gentrification and displacement in cities, which has a large impact on lower income folks, communities of color. But I think the other story that is really focused on less is that, and Keith brought this up, is that, lots of census tracts are resegregating, becoming more segregated. So on the one hand, you've got gentrification happening, which is displacing folks. And on the other, you've got continued housing segregation. So, maybe the point here is that really it's a multi-pronged approach in terms of, increasing wages and opening up employment to folks, to having access to healthcare in communities where people live, access to quality education. Those types of things really kind of lay the groundwork for creating a more equitable society and having more equitable housing and fulfilling the Fair Housing Act's. There's the promise, but really it's an obligation under the law to affirmatively further fair housing and create integrated neighborhoods where everyone has access to opportunity.
Thanks, Jay. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that, and just the work of Southwest Fair Housing Council and thinking about how to be involved in a number of different aspects to really get at some systems change policies here. And one thing that I'd like to shift the conversation to is the work happening in Pima County and the Prosperity Initiative there, because I think that's really exciting and just really encouraging to see a jurisdiction really looking at intentional policies. So Keith, would you like to talk a little bit more about the Prosperity Initiative and share with all of our audience more about what you're doing?
I'm very happy to. So the Prosperity Initiative, this is like a dream for me as a sociologist and someone who cares about poverty. The Pima County has initiated a process of involving regional governments in Pima County, city and county employees, bureaucrats working on housing issues and poverty issues, and academics. I'm one of those who are doing research on policies that have the capacity to break intergenerational patterns of poverty and also make sense to be implemented at a local level. So we're looking really broadly across a wide range of areas where there could be highly effective interventions. So we're trying to find policies that have a strong research base, strong evidence base of efficacy in other contexts. And for this conversation, I was just going to speak briefly to a couple of the areas that we're focusing on in the realm of housing. So one of those is focused on using affordable housing to deconcentrate poverty, especially the spatial concentration of poverty. So effectively, very simply, this is just as we think about increasing the housing stock broadly, and as we think especially about increasing the stock of affordable housing, that those opportunities should be more spatially distributed in areas of opportunity, right? So you can kind of start trying to break some of these very strong patterns of spatial segregation. On top of that, there's very strong positive benefits to folks relocating to higher opportunity areas. That's been long demonstrated through many different studies. So this is things like using vouchers to give households living in low-income communities an opportunity to move to a lower poverty part of the city. So that's one piece that we've been focusing on. And then the other policy area that I just wanted to speak to briefly, and this is still an active conversation in the initiative, but the more time I've spent on this, the more I've become convinced that simply increasing the stock of affordable housing is the most cost-effective way to reduce poverty. And if you want a way to break intergenerational cycles of poverty, the fewer kids that are in poor households, the fewer are going to be kind of met with all those constraints and kind of drains on their capacity to not be poor as an adult. And so for me, that's, it kind of makes sense on a very basic logical level, but it's a big ask, right? You're kind of suggesting to really shift market dynamics. However, on the other hand, we've seen what's happened over the last 20, 30 years, right? We've watched a market dynamic shift in a negative direction, and I'm very confident that we would have the capacity to push back on that. But again, this involves like very explicit political decisions. But if you reduce, if you bring down housing costs, you reduce the major expense for any poor household. That frees up the income that they can spend on other things. That means that they might have just a little more resources to mitigate a crisis. It might mean they have a little more resources to invest in something positive, some opportunity, educational or extracurricular for your child. But again, you think about how do we reduce poverty? You get people more income somehow, or you reduce their costs. And there's such a reticence, right, to providing direct funds to low-income households for a whole host of reasons we don't need to get into here. But if that's a hard ask, and setting up a new benefit structure is kind of an administrative ask for local governments, a different way to go would be simply to reduce this major cost. The last thing I'll just add to that is the more that I have digged into, I thought I had a really good understanding of how bad evictions are, but having done a very fresh dive into like the dozens and dozens of extremely rigorously demonstrated negative impacts. You talk about physical health, mental health, physical health of adults and children. You talk about long-term cognitive and educational impacts for children. Housing instability is incredibly damaging, incredibly stressful for adults and children. And so a lack of affordable housing, a lack of somewhere to go when you're in these stressful transition moments, all of which combine to real harm, really intense harm that is highly concentrated in low-income communities and very disproportionately borne by people from historically marginalized backgrounds. And so if you look at what group is most at risk of housing instability, it's women of color with children, right, have the highest rates of housing instability. So we're highly concentrating that harm on a real subset of our communities that again kind of often cycle in and out of this very stressful situation. And so, you know, for me, this is sort of I don't know, you're getting into the real basics of people's lived experience here. And again, I feel like having these conversations about directly addressing these types of concentrated harms and inequities are not being had in a very serious way, in my opinion. We have a lot of rhetoric about equity and diversity and involving this in our conversations. We have decades and decades of established social science research that shows that the origin of these inequities are from systematic discrimination in housing markets and lending markets over time. There's been systematic wealth generating opportunities that have been reserved for white folks for generations. Right. So now we're in a situation where we have this massive inequity. It's causing this ongoing harm. And then we're having all this conversation about investing in historically underinvested in communities and equity. But I don't see the funding and the real material investments that would be necessary to really address those inequities. And so to me, there's a even more jarring disjuncture between what we're doing and what's actually happening in the market. So I'll just stop. I'm kind of rambling there, but that's a basic sense of what the Prosperity Initiative is trying to do, and especially in that area of housing.
And Serena, if I could jump in here as well, I think it's just critically important, the work that Keith and Bonnie Bazada and the folks in Pima County are doing around this Prosperity Initiative. And I really love the framing of that, the Prosperity Initiative. And I think that, you know, we really do need to think about the framework that we're all thinking about poverty. And I just heard something recently that really stuck with me. Matthew Desmond, who wrote Evicted, has a new book out. And one of the things I heard him say was that he was a poverty abolitionist. And, you know, it really kind of helped me to think about how to go about this work, you know, as I progress in my career, and really thinking about, you know, being a poverty abolitionist. And I think what is important about that is looking at all of the ways that we benefit and that society benefits from poverty. And I think the other framework that is really resonating with me right now is that this is a choice. Housing equity, poverty, all of the things that go along with it is a choice that we are all making as society to continue with this, because, you know, I guess I don't think it's rocket science in terms of what can be done to really alleviate a lot of these issues that we're talking about. It's just that we're not really doing it. You know, we could build more permanent affordable housing. I mean, that is something that could be done. We are not doing that. You know, we're just relying on the market to address these issues, whether it's low-income housing tax credits or even the Section 8 program. You know, and Keith touched on this earlier, it's really relying on what's available in the market, and that is failing a lot of people. I think the other thing that is really critical for us to think about in terms of, you know, how we're addressing poverty is we need to measure it, and we need to look at the policies that we're creating in our cities and towns and communities and really measure the impact that these policies are having, right? You know, Keith's work is really looking at, in my opinion, creating this equity lens to build policy. But then once that policy is in place, what are we doing over time to measure how the policies that we're putting in place are improving the things that we're talking about? You know, are evictions going down? Is segregation alleviating? Are wages going up? You know, there are lots of different things that we can look at to measure over time. And if those statistics are not getting better, we're not doing what we need to be doing to eliminate poverty. So I think that the measurement piece is critical. And I think that really, you know, I feel like it was a call for myself, and I would really encourage others to think about, you know, what it means to be a poverty abolitionist, and, you know, to really think that this is a choice that we're making as a society. And, you know, I think the pandemic actually was really interesting. One of the things that came out of it that I think could be seen as positive, or at least provides evidence about how to deal with this issue, is that I also just heard that poverty dropped down to 8% during the pandemic because of the programs that were put in place, the child tax credit, the eviction moratorium, and eviction prevention help. So, right, these things are not things that are new or things that are complicated to understand, right? It's, you know, we prevent eviction if we provide more money to folks to afford housing, if we you know, look at the tax code and you know, things like that. There are very concrete ways to address this issue now, today, that we just are not doing. So I think the work Keith is doing is really great in that sense. And, you know, it just, again, some thoughts about, you know, particularly how I've been looking at this issue and what, you know, I think we as advocates can do going forward.
And point well taken, Jay, about needing to measure housing opportunity. And I think one of the points that Maya made earlier was that we do have some good data and statistics about what's happening to people with disabilities when they face housing instability. And Maya, do you just want to talk about some of the downstream impacts? Because I think that's a really clear example of how we have a lot more information about how to inform policy, because we are keeping good track of that particular population, and knowing and understanding what is happening to people with disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I touch on that, I just wanted to kind of piggyback a little bit on both Keith and Jay's discussion of, you know, the need for increasing the stock of affordable housing, and just also mention, you know, anecdotally, our office has just, I would say, over the last year and a half or so, probably a little bit longer than that, just seen an enormous spike in the inability of people who are already part of a voucher program to even be able to utilize their vouchers, because the housing market is so skewed at the moment, and there's such a lack of affordable housing that's available. And so when you look at these issues and say, okay, this is obviously a good program fundamentally, and in theory could create opportunities for people to move to, you know, higher income neighborhoods and have more access to opportunity, but the market is so constrained in the current reality that, you know, that is posing a barrier to being able to have access to housing and have access to housing of people's choosing, that I think it just reinforces the need to have more intention and more than just simply, you know, allowing the market to do its thing. I would share from my perspective, at least. And then getting to, you know, Serena's question, I would say one of the things I did want to highlight is, you know, housing and stability is obviously important for everybody. We know, and I think everybody on the call would acknowledge that that is just critically important for all aspects of life, to have stable housing. But the instability can have a disproportionate impact on people with disabilities who are, you know, facing housing instability. I think one of the reasons for that, it's sort of a heightened problem, is that again, going back to the earlier discussions about, if you've made a modification to your unit, finding a unit that has the same features is not exactly a one-for-one. It's again, it can pose some additional burdens, and modifications too are often the obligation of the tenant to pay for them. So they might not be able to afford to do it again to another apartment if they were to, lose the unit that they're in. And then I think Keith mentioned this earlier too, just the higher proportion of people with disabilities that are on a limited income or a fixed income, due to the nature of their disability and the lack of opportunity in the workplace too. Jay tied in earlier discrimination in employment, and that's obviously, something that unfortunately continues to be pervasive for people with disabilities as well. And then I would also just kind of ask people to think a little bit about, putting yourself in somebody's shoes for a moment, and just the physical burdens and anxiety that having to move and all of that entails, or housing instability and not knowing where you're going next would have for everyone. And if you have a person with a disability that already experiences heightened anxiety or has some difficulty, navigating the physical world, those things are all just exacerbated when you're facing housing instability for this particular population. So, I did, our office, my perspective is a little skewed. I think Keith shared that his tended to the negative as well, but ours as well, because people contact us when they're facing problems with their housing providers and not getting what they need. But there are, I think, on a more like micro level, policies and practices that I think housing providers and, agencies too that work with individuals to ensure that they have access to housing can do to ensure better compliance with the Fair Housing Act. And I think one of those things is to have clear policies about accommodations and modifications, making sure that it's very clear what the policy is and that it's in accordance with the Fair Housing Act. And then one of the things that we always push for is training. You can have a perfect policy, but if the people who work for you are not trained on it or don't know about it, it's not going to do much good for the people that are needing to access that service. So ensuring that staff and whomever is interacting and interfacing with individuals is up to speed on what those requirements are and sort of how to avoid pitfalls and problems with compliance, I think is a critical piece.
Thanks, Maya. I appreciate it. And if people were interested in fair housing training, Jay, is that something that Southwest Fair Housing Council offers?
We do indeed. We offer fair housing trainings throughout Arizona. So the Southwest Fair Housing Council does serve all of Arizona. And interestingly enough, that was another change with the pandemic, as we started to do much more, well, for a while, all of our training online. And we started to get folks from outside Arizona attending virtual trainings. But you can go to our website. We have regular virtual training set up about once every other week. And we also do in-person trainings and can tailor trainings from Fair Housing 101 all the way up to, we also offer continuing education for real estate agents on fair housing through our real estate school. So yes, that is definitely a part of the core of what we do, is to provide trainings to really anybody who wants to know more about the Fair Housing Act. So thanks for the shout out.
Thanks, Jay. Apologies if I'm a little choppy. I'm getting the internet connection is unstable note. So sorry about that, folks. I definitely want us to get to solutions and soon, but we've had one question pop up about the about mobile home parks, and that's been a big issue in Phoenix. So I want to get to that in a moment. And before we get to that, I'll just say to everyone who's been asking great questions in the chat, the wonderful thing about these online conversations is that we have a robust chat and lots of people who have good questions and a wealth of information. We never have enough time to talk about these important topics. So apologies if we don't get to your questions, but please keep asking questions. And if you've raised your hand, please see if you can type your question into the chat or into the Q&A. It just gets a little tricky to have people unmute and everything, and we just don't have time for that today, unfortunately. But we are really interested in answering your questions, so please continue to keep those coming. So I wanted to ask one of the questions that had popped up in the Q&A about what are your opinions on how to prevent the selling of mobile home park land where residents own their mobile homes who are facing displacement in Phoenix. And I know that's not just a Phoenix issue, but that's something that we're seeing across Arizona. So I don't know if any of you have some thoughts on displacement, particularly regarding mobile home parks, but I think that that's an issue that's been getting a lot of attention lately. So let's take some time to discuss it.
I'd be happy to jump in here just to get the ball rolling. This is such a hard issue in a lot of ways, but I think it just kind of illustrates all that we've been talking about in terms of how we address housing stability, just generally speaking, right? I mean, I think that we've seen that there isn't much that can be done under the current way that we deal with housing, right? I mean, I've been following it kind of peripherally, but my understanding is that the city of Phoenix, the city council, tried to undertake this and figure out something to do, and they were very not able to come up with a very, very good solution, if one at all. So, I guess I feel like, unfortunately, there's not a lot that we can do because the market allows this to happen, and there's very little help for folks who have this kind of housing instability. And it's something that we see all the time. I mean, taking it kind of to the broader housing in general. I mean, at Southwest Fair Housing Council, we get around 800 phone calls or client contacts, however you want to describe it, a year. And the vast majority of those are landlord-tenant issues. And we are not equipped to address those issues. And it turns out that there's just very few resources for folks that are having landlord-tenant issues, facing evictions, not able to pay rent, living in substandard housing where their landlords are unresponsive. So, I guess it's just one of those things that it seems very tragic in how we address housing. I guess one kind of sliver of that, though, is folks that are being facing eviction or needing to move or whatever. If you do have a disability, as Maya was mentioning, you can potentially ask for a reasonable accommodation if you need more time than the typical 30 days that people have to move, or shorter during an eviction, in order to be able to move. But I wish I had a better answer, but frankly, I don't. And when I see the City Council of Phoenix struggling as well, I think again it just kind of highlights where we are with housing and how we address 30-40% of folks that are kind of living with housing instability.
I'll just piggyback up to Jay. I share that understanding, right? That there's very little we can do, especially in Arizona, to constrain or control the actions of market actors. That said, I do think that there are plenty of options that could bolster the capacity of such mobile home residents to resist such pressures or displacement. So that includes like facilitating land ownership, home ownership. There's a cooperative land trust models that can be used. You also have situations where, I won't get into that, but you could also have city and county actors potentially purchase land and have special conditions on it in terms of affordability and use. Some of that would still involve displacement, of course, but again, in terms of targeting resources. But again, these have to be, these things aren't free. You have to spend money on them. You have to be intentional about it. And in the absence of that, as Jay is saying, we have very little ability to constrain you think of Airbnbs, you think of all these other kind of market pressures that are whipsawing our housing stock. We can't control that, but we can do a lot of on the other side in terms of bolstering and providing support for households. And I'll just say really quickly as well, back to the big picture affordable housing stock issue. I think Maya did a good job of highlighting the intensity, like individual level intensity of the experience of housing insecurity. But when, I think it's just really important to emphasize that when there's an absence of accessible, affordable housing, it magnifies so many problems for people on an individual level. Like if you're in a bad situation with abuse with a parent or a housemate or a partner, and you can't leave because you're kind of economically constrained and don't have other options, that takes a hard situation and turns it into a real intense crisis that sometimes is not resolved in an appropriate way. And at a macro level, as Maya was also intimating, our main system for rehousing folks relies on vouchers. And that system assumes the availability of affordable housing that those vouchers can pay for. So the lack of affordable housing is starting to really break our basic system for dealing with housing instability and homelessness on a pretty deep level. And that is also very disheartening for those poor individuals who are searching for a unit within 90 days and then not able to find one. And then they lose their voucher and they have to go on the list again. And I talk to homeless people all the time who have had these types of experiences of patiently doing all the things, getting their ID, going through the process, waiting months and months and months, sometimes years, getting a voucher, and then not being able to use it and then losing it. And so why would people engage in services? Why would people trust when so much of their time has been wasted? And so I just really want to emphasize that, and we talk about it for these mobile home parks, maybe displacement wouldn't, again, it wouldn't be as bad if there was somewhere else for them to go, right? So I'm just saying that it creates a more intensity, more of a crisis atmosphere. And again, I'll just say again, that's highly, highly concentrated amongst very low income households and particularly people of color. And so I think that is, constantly lost because the concentrations, the consequences are so geographically and kind of like economically and socially concentrated amongst a certain subset of our community members.
Thanks, Keith. And I really appreciate the way that all of you today have emphasized just that the harms are not proportionate and that the harms disproportionately impact people of color, disproportionately impact people with disabilities. So I am grateful that that continues to come up this morning. So thank you all for emphasizing that. Keith, one of the things that you've been researching are policies, and you've been touching on this, but is there a particular policy that you're most excited about, or if you could go to every city and town or county in Arizona and say, this is the thing that I think everyone should be looking at? Is there one policy, or do you think that it's different communities need different solutions?
So that's an extremely hard question, but my stab I'll take at it. I really am becoming more convinced that zoning is just a central barrier to kind of infill and the creation of lots of people need lots of different types of housing options, and people really need very low end accessible opportunities to build equity. So smaller lots, smaller homes, more kind of like transitional, like I'm moving into a shelter, now I'm moving into a rental subsidy situation, and then now there's some very low end affordable purchase opportunity for me to actually start building equity. That is, I would say, completely like the absence of that in our market is so dramatic, and it's very understandable why people don't have avenues to wealth creation and exiting poverty and housing insecurity. So I think zoning for me is top of the list. I also think that, yeah, well, actually, I'll be quiet and then I'll come back. I'll let Jay or Maya hop in.
This is shameless self-promotion, I guess, but we had another panel discussion about zoning last year with some amazing panelists, and I'll drop the link to that in the chat because I learned so much from all of them. So I'll echo what Keith says about zoning, and just I'm glad that came up today, but definitely worth a watch if you have some time. Jay, go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I'm also on the board of the National Fair Housing Alliance, so have had some more connection to at least understanding a little bit about federal housing policy. And, in a lot of ways, I guess I would argue we don't have much of one. And it turns out that cities and towns, a lot of the money that they get to deal with these issues comes from the federal government, whether it's community development block grants, the home program, low-income housing tax credits. For the most part, those are federal programs. And I think, we've seen cities across the country start to try and figure out how to address this on their own, whether it's with housing bonds or other ways. And, those are certainly having an impact, but I just don't think that, it's the impact, it's not meeting the need. So, I really do think that we need a better federal housing policy. Again, I think that we need to be investing in permanent affordable housing. There are many different models to do that. I think we all think of, the public housing projects in some of the big cities that, were, essentially torn down, and all of the problems there. But I think that that's the anomaly more. And I think there are lots of ways to go about it. And I think also what gets lost here for me, in a sense, is, we're never going to get rid of the private housing market. So I don't think anybody is arguing that that should happen. And I think that, frankly, housing providers and landlords often are getting put in a bad position. I mean, most landlords are not discriminating. There are some that do, and, that's just the way things are. But, I think having the private market deal with all of this puts a pretty big burden on the private market and landlords who are, trying to do the right thing. So, I think this lack of kind of federal policy and our lack of affordable housing, puts a burden that is not necessarily a good one on landlords out there that are really trying to do the right thing. And the last thing I'll plug and point out is that the federal government, HUD, is taking comments. I think today is the last day to comment on the new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. So there was a rule passed in 2015 that provided more guidance for jurisdictions to meet their fair housing and affirmatively furthering fair housing guidelines. So I'm really excited to see and happy to see that there is going to be more guidance about how cities like, again, I'm in Tucson, the Commission for Equitable Housing and Development, and the city of Tucson really is looking to try and figure out how to meet some of these obligations. And I think that this new rule will help move that ball forward. So that's something that is happening now that I'm excited about and think is a good piece of the puzzle.
I'll just jump in very quickly to say I completely agree with that last piece as well. So much of this, we're talking about a federal law. The Fair Housing Act is a federal law. And so having that direction and the intentionality coming from the top, obviously a lot of these solutions I think are local, and certainly involve local strategies and need to kind of individualize it based on the place. But I think that core guidance and the core sort of compliance guidance, for lack of a better word, is got to come from the top, so to speak, and having that out there and having it be a priority for the administration, I think is huge for this space. So keep our fingers crossed it does what we all hope it will.
And Serena, if I can just jump back in really quickly, when Jay is saying federal policy, I'm just thinking about the reduced funding coming from the federal government to support affordable housing over decades. And so I think this is about resources, right? Number one, right? If you ask me what the number one thing is, there needs to be more resources for affordable housing. We need more non-market options for people. And I think that in addition to that, we need long-term planning. If we could say we have a plan to have a stable stock of affordable housing over the next 5, 10, 15 years, that would dramatically reduce the risk that our low-income communities are experiencing over time. I think we're all aware we're living in a more volatile world, right? We have prices shifting around, world events, the climate, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff is happening that's really undermining people's financial security. And this is an area where we do have, like Jay said, we have solutions. We know what works. It's not rocket science. It's not magic. We just need more affordable housing. And so those investments, but again, that's where the rubber really meets the road, right? You really need to find a way to pay for these things. And I think as the federal government has retreated, not completely, but they've pulled back the scope of involvement. To me, that really says that states and local governments really do need to step up. We've benefited historically in Arizona from an incredibly affordable housing stock for many, many years that allowed us to kind of function without as much planning. We don't live in that world anymore, and we really need to change our orientation to really protect this like basic essential need that households need to survive. So I think intentional planning for me is like top of the list. And I know that, again, people think like, you think of the revenues at the local level and the scope of the problem, but I think there's a huge array of things that can be done to incentivize development. There's partnerships. You can think of other types of solutions, home sharing, connecting students with older folks. There's lots of ways, kind of unique situation-specific solutions that can dramatically expand the scope and the options available for people to find affordable housing. But I don't feel the leadership. And I definitely, as someone who has watched this housing, this crisis we just went through with COVID, and then with the eviction moratoriums, we're in a worse situation. People are in a tighter situation now. And because the unemployment rate has gone down, I feel like we've just moved on to, okay, we're moving on. But evictions are still very high. Evictions, again, are still highly concentrated in these low-income communities. And I feel like people are just moving on. And it feels really inappropriate to me. And again, the costs of that harm are borne by us, by our hospitals, by our law enforcement, by our, health insurance systems, right? And by our children and our community members. So anyway, I probably said that 4 times now, so I'll get off my hobby horse.
It's a good soapbox to be on. So thank you for sharing that. And I know there's a lot of folks from health insurers and from the healthcare system. So I think that what you just said will really resonate with a lot of our audience. I wanted to address some of these audience questions. Carson had asked about how do we combat NIMBYism. I really like this question from Mike about the framing of the issue when addressing NIMBYism, or I love this acronym, BANANA, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone mindset. And have any of you seen shifts when using people first humanizing language on houseless, unsheltered populations, affordable rents and mortgages? When you are doing your work and you use that language, have you seen a change in people's attitudes? And what do you think overall we can do to combat NIMBYism? Another easy question for you all, sorry.
I
feel like I've been talking a lot, but I'll please, Maya, go.
Oh, no, well, I was just going to share. I mean, I think one of the ways that we can do that is zoning and ensuring that there are, I don't know. I mean, I would say some of the more systemic problems that we've seen crop up with regard to the Fair Housing Act is how some local ordinances are written. There's NIMBYism written into them. They intentionally make it more difficult for a group home, for example, to situate in a neighborhood, and they make additional barriers in order for that to occur. And so I think, ensuring that there are ordinances and sort of things on the local level that are in compliance with the Fair Housing Act and the sort of true spirit of that is one way to potentially combat NIMBYism. In terms of the language, I mean, we in the disability community, obviously have had lots of discussions about people first language when it comes to folks with disabilities. I think the movement towards sensitivity about unhoused populations is a slower arc as far as I've seen in our work, and getting people to sort of understand that and implement it in their practice. But I think it's coming, would be my sense of that.
I've been involved in a couple different efforts here locally that are attempting to provide some education around these issues specifically. Also, I'm connected to the Tucson for Everyone, which is a YIMBY group, Yes in My Backyard organization here that has been setting up some kind of education campaigns. So I'll just say that on the one hand, on an individual level, when I'm talking to people, I do feel like basic information about the situation, how bad homelessness is, what the zoning laws actually look like. You show a map, like, look how much of the majority of the city is R1, where are people going to live in a duplex or an apartment complex. So I do think that information can be very persuasive. I think the problem I'm finding is that it's very hard to get people to engage in that. So you can provide the education, but it's really hard to get people to come and take it. So the thing we're working on right now is to do these little presentations with neighborhood associations. And again, just trying to outline the scope of the problem, the way in which these choices contribute to this outcome, because I do think there's a big disconnect for folks between preserving the quality of their local neighborhood versus these big picture impacts that they're directly connected to. And I think people have a lot of investment in the cognitive dissonance necessary to kind of keep those two things straight in your mind at the same time. But I do think that you can break through some of that with conversation. But again, these conversations are so incredibly hard. And then you have situations where it's not the privileged white person who is kind of taking a contrarian position. It's a low-income legacy resident, and they don't want to be pushed out. They're concerned about gentrification or other concerns. And then, how is it my place to tell them what to feel about this, right? So I just think that people arrive at NIMBYism through many different avenues, and it's extremely complicated. So I'll just say, as to the question, I'm looking for the answer to that question as well. So
I just want to jump in here real quick, Serena, too. I mean, I think it's important to really think about the context here as well. I mean, basically, for better or for worse, the way that people build wealth in this country is through home ownership. And if you buy into home ownership, you buy a home, and you have a concept of how that is going to work and that you're going to build wealth over time, and that's what you're passing on to your grandchildren, or how you're paying for college, or it's going to be your nest egg for retirement. I mean, it's really easy to understand why people have these reactions, right? It's really kind of touching at the core of how we've set up society. So while I don't condone NIMBYism, I think it's important to understand how the system has set this up for making it really hard for people invested in single family homes in particular to see a different way forward. So I don't, that again doesn't excuse it for me necessarily, but I think it is important to realize just how foundational and fundamental home ownership is, and how much people are invested in that, and that's a lot of why we have this NIMBYism. So again, how do we solve that issue? I don't know, but I do think it's important to think about that, as opposed to thinking all folks who are, opposed to, a housing complex in their neighborhood are bad people, or, kind of these negative thoughts. There's just a lot that goes into that, that I think, leads to NIMBYism, as opposed to people just being like, oh, well, we don't want an apartment complex. It's a very deep-seated issue that, essentially the country is built on, right? Wealth creation through home ownership. So.
And I'll just very quickly add, I really agree with that, Jay. People are socialized into this system of understandings, and it's not necessarily a affirmative choice they're making, right? Because that's the default way of dealing with these things. And the other thing I've really noticed from this work that we've been doing and trying to educate and help people imagine a different way of kind of organizing asset building and home ownership, ideas like rental equity, like if you're a landlord, maybe allow your tenant to build a little bit of equity up. You don't have to give them everything back that they gave you, right? But if, some percentage of what you're profiting from hypothetically could be written into a rental contract. And just that idea, I think, is so contrary to the basic way that we've done everything, that it's really like, people are like, oh, wow, I never even imagined you could do that. Oh, you can do that, you blah, blah, blah. And so I think there's lots of equivalent ways of thinking about your neighborhood and, allowing access and sharing of the asset and equity that does really require like kind of a big cultural shift. But I think we need it.
Thanks, Keith. And thanks for bringing that up. I think that one of the ways that we start to shift the conversation is through these kind of discussions, and just bringing up the possible solutions and remedies that you all have brought up today. So we're coming to the end of our time together, and I'll give each of the panelists a chance to share their final thoughts. But first, I just wanted to thank all of the people who came to this conversation today. the audience members, you've been incredible. And I just really appreciate the robust conversation in the chat and the sharing of resources, the exceptional questions, and just your thoughtfulness about this really important topic of ensuring housing opportunity for all. And I really want to thank the panelists for generously sharing their time and knowledge. And I'll be sure to send out contact information, links to resources that we've discussed today. So everyone who registered for the webinar, which is all of you, that's how you're here, you'll get the email with the link to this recording, and feel free to share that with folks. And I will, and then this will be posted on the Arizona Partnership for Healthy Communities website as well. So thank you to Southwest Fair Housing Council for co-hosting this conversation with the Arizona Partnership for Healthy Communities and LISC Phoenix today. And I will turn it over to our panelists for final thoughts. Any last words you'd like to leave our audience members with? Maya, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I would just say thanks again to fellow panelists for a very interesting conversation, and thank you all for joining us today. I would just say, the Arizona Center for Disability Law engages in both systemic and individual advocacy, and just viewing the participant lists from who all is on the conversation, I just wanted to share that, if you're ever working with individuals that are facing housing discrimination, potential housing discrimination, and they're an individual with a disability, please encourage them to contact us. We have limited resources, so we can't provide individual representation for everybody, but we can certainly provide, at the bare minimum, self-advocacy assistance. So just wanted to put that plug in and say thank you again for the great conversation.
Thanks, Maya. I'll make sure that there's a link to the Arizona Center for Disability Law in the follow-up email. Jay, final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I just kind of want to go back to, Keith's work and his prosperity initiative that he and Bonnie and others are working on. And really, I think what we're talking about here, and I think it's important to reframe this as really, we're talking about a prosperity initiative. We want our communities to be more prosperous. And the things that we're talking about are barriers to people becoming more prosperous, and these systems and things are in place that are keeping people poor. We're making a choice here, and by we, I mean myself and others, in terms of keeping poverty at the levels that they are and have been for many years. And we have the solution. So let's not be mistaken. I mean, we have a lot of ideas and solutions about how we could have more equitable housing and reduce poverty overall. And again, something that I just heard recently that I'll leave people with as well is, what does it mean to really be a poverty abolitionist, to work towards having zero poverty in this country? Because I do think it is possible, and I think it's something that particularly I am thinking about more, and would encourage everybody listening to think about how to do that personally and in the social structures that we move in.
Thanks, Jay. What a great note to wrap things up with. But final thoughts, I'll turn it over to Keith to wrap this up.
I also just want to echo Maya's appreciation for Maya, Jay. This has been I really appreciate you both. I just want to say this last piece, speaking as a community member and not as a professor at UA, and not in my role with the Pima County. But I've been really stuck on this phrase lately in my mind of abundant, very affordable housing, which is something that used to be here. When I moved here in 2001, I could get a 2-bedroom for $600, $500 as a grad student making $13,000 a year. It allowed me to live comfortably. I wasn't doing great. I wasn't flying all over the place, but I was able to live comfortably. And that's what I said to my friends at the time, was that, it's easy to live here. I've never had such low overall stress. And when I think about how I would love to get back to a place like that, I know it's, for all the darkness that I've been mentioning, I have to focus on something positive to kind of feel like there's a reason to keep doing this work. And I just really feel like we have an opportunity now. Like I was saying before, our conversations about equity and our research on the history of our community, they're all here, right? We know what went wrong. We know who was discriminated against. And so in responding to this problem, maybe at a more local level, so that we have a little more control over our own circumstances, I just think we have an amazing opportunity. We can reduce poverty. We can address very deep, currently totally unaddressed inequities that are a direct consequence of aggressive and extreme discrimination. And we can kind of improve the quality of life for a lot of folks in our community, again, all of which benefits us and reduces our public costs. So I just really hope that there's some more aggressive leadership around this, and just a broad-based push to get as many of these options on the table as possible. And I just think that a lot of harm can be involved. And again, and I have to end on a dark note, if we can build more capacity, right? We're in this volatile world. We're going to have these new challenges. I'm very afraid of what's coming in terms of climate refugees, more climate disasters, right? People moving all over the country because of things happening, right? We're really vulnerable, in my opinion. And if we can do a better job at kind of like solidifying our base, working together to protect our kind of most vulnerable community members, they're going to be less at risk when that next challenge comes, next pandemic, next recession, whatever it is. And we'll have more capacity, I hope, to respond to whatever that new challenge is. So I'll just stop there, and sorry for being so stark, but I appreciate the time. Thank you, Serena. Thank you, Jay.
Thanks, Keith. I don't think it's negative necessarily, but it's a call to action for all of us. And like you said, we need good leadership on housing opportunity. And each of you is a tremendous leader in this realm. So thank you so much for being here today and for your leadership on this really, really important issue. And thank you all to the audience for being such an active voice on this important topic. And we'll see you all again soon. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.